The boy had nothing but the clothes on his back and a crust of bread he had guarded like treasure through long days of hunger. The West had stripped him of kin, home, and comfort, yet hunger had not taken the last ember of kindness from his heart. When he saw the tired man collapse on the dusty road, his hands trembling with exhaustion, the boy did not hesitate. He pressed the bread into the man's hands, though his own stomach twisted with emptiness. It was an act so small it might have gone unnoticed, but in the unforgiving silence of the valley, it was louder than thunder. The man ate slowly, his eyes fixed on the orphan who had given him everything he had. No words passed between them, but something unspoken flowed like a river. In a land where men took more than they gave, where survival often meant turning away from the weak, this boy had chosen differently. He had chosen to give, though he had nothing left to spare. It was a gesture that would ripple far beyond the dusty road on which it was made. By nightfall, the story had reached the ears of the valley's elders. These were men hardened by decades of storms, droughts, and bloodshed, their faces etched with the lines of survival and the weight of decisions that had cost lives. They gathered in the council hall, their voices heavy with debate, not over the worth of the bread, but over the worth of the boy who had given it away. In his sacrifice, they saw something the valley had long forgotten, the strength that comes not from rifles or gold, but from the courage to put another before oneself. When the boy was called before them, he did not understand why. His bare feet shuffled against the wooden floor, his head bowed, expecting nothing but questions he could not answer. Yet instead of scorn, the elders offered him a place, a duty none had expected to fall on such narrow shoulders. They named him the guardian of the valley, not because of his strength, but because of his heart. And in their decision, they entrusted the safety of generations to a child who had known only loss. Thus began a story the valley would never forget. A boy, nameless and hungry, who gave away his last piece of bread, was lifted into a role no warrior had ever held. The West, cruel and merciless, had given him nothing, yet in return he gave everything he had. And from that gift, the legend of the valley's guardian was born, not in triumph or conquest, but in the quiet power of kindness that defied hunger and death alike. The valley was not a place of ease, but of trials carved deep into the earth. Dry winds scoured the soil, and the mountains stood like stern guardians, watching all who dared to settle there. Families who lived within its boundaries knew that survival was a daily battle, against drought, against hunger, against men who saw weakness as an invitation to take. And yet, when the elders placed the mantle of guardian upon the boy, something shifted in the hearts of those weary souls. It was not his strength they saw, for he was thin and frail. It was his spirit, a spirit that refused to hoard even the smallest crumb of bread when another soul was in need. The boy did not understand the weight of the task given to him. He was used to wandering alone, to sleeping beneath broken barns and abandoned wagons, to taking only what was necessary to see the next sunrise. Now, he was told the valley itself was his to protect. At first, he resisted. How could a child with nothing protect an entire people? But the elders' eyes did not waver, and their decision did not falter. They spoke of how the land needed not another gunman, nor another greedy hand reaching for power, but a heart that could not be bent by hunger or fear. Slowly, the boy grew into his role, not through force, but through example. He worked alongside the farmers, his bare feet sinking into the furrows of parched fields, his hands blistering as he carried buckets from the well. He shared the same meals they ate, thin stew and hard bread, and slept on the same dirt floors. In doing so, he became more than a symbol. He became one of them. The people of the valley saw their own struggles mirrored in him, and in his presence, they began to believe that survival was possible. But whispers carried across the plains, reaching men who thrived on preying upon weakness. They heard that the valley had placed its hope in a boy, and they laughed. To them, this was not strength, but foolishness, an open invitation to raid and plunder. Yet when they came, their mockery faltered. For it was not the boy's fists or guns that met them. It was the unity of the valley, bound together by his example. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder, women held their ground, and even the smallest children clung to stones with fire in their eyes. In their defiance, the raiders saw something they did not expect. A people unafraid, because they had given their trust to someone who had nothing to take for himself. Though battles scarred the valley and smoke darkened its skies, each time the enemy withdrew, defeated not by weapons, but by the unyielding will of a boy who gave without hesitation. And with every victory, the legend of the Guardian grew stronger. Seasons passed, and the boy began to change, not into a warrior, but into something greater. His shoulders broadened, his hands grew calloused, and his eyes carried the depth of one who had endured more than his years should bear. Yet he never claimed authority, never raised his voice in command. His leadership was not born from shouting orders, but from standing where others faltered, from sharing in the burdens of the people he had sworn to protect. When drought struck the valley, and the wells turned to dust, the boy did not take the last of the water for himself. He carried buckets through the night, giving to the sick and the elderly before drinking a single drop. When bandits stole livestock, he walked for days across the plains to return what was taken, arriving half-starved but never empty-handed. Each act carved his story deeper into the memory of the valley, each sacrifice proving that his guardianship was more than a title. It was a truth lived each day. Children grew up under his watch, no longer fearing the sound of hoofbeats at night. They would gather around him in the evenings, listening to the quiet stories he told, not of battles or victories, but of kindnesses too small to be remembered by most. He taught them that strength was not in the weight of a gun, but in the courage to share, even when you had nothing. And as those children grew, they carried his lessons into the soil, the river, and the very bones of the valley. But beyond the valley's borders, envy simmered. Men who ruled with cruelty could not bear the thought that a nameless orphan had become a symbol greater than their crowns. They sent envoys with honeyed words, promising wealth and titles if he would abandon his guardianship. The boy listened, his face still and unreadable, before returning to the fields the next day, hoe in hand, working as if nothing had been said. His refusal was not shouted, but spoken through the dust that clung to his skin and the sweat that fell from his brow. And so the valley endured, not because it was free from hardship, but because its guardian bore those hardships without flinching. The boy who once gave away his only bread now carried an entire people with the same steady resolve. And though the world beyond plotted to crush him, within the valley his name was spoken not in fear or pity, but in reverence, as the one who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. Years in the valley passed like the slow turning of the seasons, each hardship shaping the boy as surely as the winds carved the cliffs. Yet despite his growing strength, he never claimed ownership over the people who followed him. He remained, in their eyes, the orphan who gave without hesitation. It was that memory that bound them to him tighter than chains ever could. In a land where betrayal was common as dust, and men often sold their souls for survival, his constancy was a rare and precious thing. Still, not every challenge came with fire and blood. Some came in silence, creeping into the hearts of the very people he protected. Jealousy, fear, and doubt began to stir. A few whispered that no child, no matter how noble, should hold the weight of an entire valley. Others wondered if his kindness was weakness, if mercy would one day open the gates to ruin. These doubts spread like cracks in dry soil, threatening to fracture the unity he had worked so hard to build. The boy faced this storm as he had faced every other, not with anger, but with patience. He did not silence his doubters with threats, nor push them aside. Instead, he shared their burdens even more openly. When the jealous man's fields failed, he worked beside him until crops sprouted anew. When the fearful widow wept that raiders would return, he stayed by her home until her nights grew calm. Slowly, suspicion gave way to shame, and shame turned into respect. His actions, more than any words, reminded them why the elders had chosen him in the first place. Meanwhile, travelers from beyond the valley began to arrive, curious about the stories carried on prairie winds. They spoke of a guardian who fought not with steel, but with sacrifice, of a people who stood against the cruelest of foes because of one boy's vow. Some came to join, others to test the truth of the legend, but all left changed. What they saw was not a king or a warrior, but a barefoot orphan walking among his people, indistinguishable from them except for the fire in his eyes. And so the legend grew, not because it was shouted from rooftops, but because it was lived in quiet moments, repeated through acts of mercy that no drought or raid could erase. The boy had not set out to carve his place in history, yet history itself began to carve him into its bones. But the West has never allowed peace to stretch too far without testing its strength. One fateful season, as the valley's harvest ripened under a rare spell of generous rains, riders descended from the northern hills. They were not simple raiders or thieves, but mercenaries, hired by men who saw the boy's legend as a threat to their power. They came with steel, with fire, and with orders to leave nothing but ash where the valley had once thrived. The people looked to their guardian, fear pressing heavy on their hearts. This time, the enemy was not one they could outlast with courage alone. The mercenaries were trained, ruthless, and far more numerous than any foe they had faced before. Yet when the boy stepped forward, there was no fear in his stance. He was not larger, nor better armed, but his presence alone steadied the trembling hands of farmers and gave strength to the weary. The battle that followed was one of fire and chaos. Fields that promised life were trampled beneath hooves, homes lit with torches, and the air filled with the clash of blades. The boy fought not with skill honed by training, but with the desperation of one who could not afford to let innocence fall. He carried the wounded, shielded children with his own body, and faced the mercenaries with nothing but the defiance burning in his chest. At the height of the chaos, when defeat seemed certain, something remarkable happened. The people of the valley rose not as victims, but as protectors. Inspired by the boy, mothers wielded shovels as weapons, old men swung hammers, and even children hurled stones with fierce resolve. What began as a slaughter became a resistance, each soul refusing to let their guardian stand alone. By dawn, the mercenaries had fled, beaten not by the strength of arms, but by the unbreakable unity of a people who would rather burn than surrender. The valley lay scarred, its harvest destroyed, yet within the ashes a new truth had taken root. The boy's guardianship was no longer his alone. The people had become his shield as much as he had become theirs. Together, they had proven that even in the unforgiving West, kindness could forge an army stronger than fear. The scars of that battle lingered across the valley. Burned homes stood like hollow skeletons against the rising sun, and the smell of smoke clung to the air long after the last embers had died. Yet within those scars, a quiet strength took root. Families rebuilt with hands raw from work. Fields were sown again, even in ash-darkened soil, and laughter returned slowly, carried on the voices of children who refused to let fear still their games. And through it all, the boy remained at the center, not as a savior above them, but as one of them, his blistered hands working beside theirs until the land began to breathe again. Travelers who came seeking the valley were struck not by walls of stone or armies of steel, but by the sight of resilience woven into every face they met. They saw a people who had bled and yet stood taller for it, guided by a boy who asked for no crown. In the saloons beyond, stories twisted the truth, claiming the guardian had called down storms or struck fear with a single glance. But those who truly walked the valley knew the miracle was simpler and greater. He had given them the courage to fight for themselves. The elders, once cautious and deliberate in their judgments, now looked upon the boy with something close to awe. They had seen many leaders rise and fall, men who demanded loyalty through fear, through promises of wealth or power. Yet here was a child who commanded none of these things, and still, every soul in the valley would lay down their life for him. It was proof that the strength of the West did not always belong to those with the sharpest rifles, but sometimes to those with the purest heart. Still, the boy himself carried doubts. At night, when silence fell heavy and the stars glittered cold above, he wondered if the elders had been wrong. He had not chosen this path, nor asked for it. He was only an orphan who once shared his bread with a stranger. Could such a small beginning truly bear the weight of an entire valley? The question haunted him like a shadow he could not outrun. And yet, each dawn brought an answer, not from his own thoughts, but from the people around him. Every time a farmer offered him the first cut of a harvest, every time a child ran to his side with a laugh, Every time a widow's tears eased beneath his quiet presence, he was reminded that guardianship was not about choice, but about constancy. It was about never turning away when others needed someone to stand. The boy's legend reached farther than even he could imagine. Traders carried his story across deserts. Cowhands sang it while driving cattle under the endless sky. And even in distant towns where cruelty reigned, whispers of the valley's guardian unsettled those who ruled through fear. The idea that a nameless orphan could rise to become the protector of many threatened every tyrant's grip. For if hope could bloom in one valley, it could spread like wildfire across the frontier. It was not long before challengers came again, but this time not with fire and steel. They came with words, draped in false kindness. Men claiming to be benefactors offered the valley riches, supplies, and security, if only the boy would step aside and let them govern in his place. To many outsiders, it seemed a simple trade, but the people of the valley knew better. They saw through the polished words, remembering too well that true guardianship could not be bought with promises. When the boy declined, his refusal was quiet, almost unnoticed, yet it rang louder than gunfire. He did not need to give reasons, for his very life was the reason. He returned to the fields, bent his back to the soil, and shared his bread as he always had. In that silence, the would-be rulers found no foothold. Their offers fell empty, and their power withered against the unshakable loyalty of a people who would not betray the one who had never betrayed them. But silence does not end hunger for power. Rejected and humiliated, these men conspired in secret. They spread lies through travelers, claiming the boy was no savior but a tyrant in disguise, that he hoarded food for himself and let the people suffer. Rumors crawled like serpents, threatening to poison the very trust that had kept the valley strong. For the first time, the boy felt the weight of a battle he could not fight with hands or courage alone, the battle for truth. And yet, as before, it was the people themselves who carried him. They did not believe the whispers, because they had seen the truth in his every step. They had eaten from his hand, walked beside him in the fields, and watched him sacrifice more than any of them could bear. Lies may spread quickly, but truth rooted in lived memory cannot be uprooted so easily. Once again, the valley stood firm, not because the boy declared himself their guardian, but because they declared it for him. The valley entered a season of uneasy calm. Crops grew again, children's laughter echoed across the fields, and for a time, it seemed as though the storms of war and betrayal had passed. Yet beneath the quiet, the boy felt the restless pull of fate. He knew the West never allowed peace to endure untested. Around him, life bloomed, but he could not shake the sense that each sunrise carried them closer to a trial greater than any before. That trial came in the form of drought. The rains ceased, the soil cracked, and the river that wound its way through the valley shrank until its bed was more dust than water. Livestock fell, crops withered, and hunger crept back into the people's bones. This was not an enemy that could be faced with rifles or driven back with courage. It was the land itself turning against them. And for the first time, whispers of despair returned. Could even the guardian of the valley fight against the sky itself? The boy did not pretend to have answers. He felt the hunger in his own belly, the dryness in his throat. Yet even in weakness, he shared what little remained. The last crust of bread in his hands was never kept for himself. The last drop of water in his cup was poured into another's. In doing so, he became something more than flesh and bone. He became a reminder that survival was not about abundance, but about unity. The people, seeing him bear the same suffering as their own, found strength where there should have been none. They rationed together, dug deeper wells, and worked as one body instead of scattered households. The drought still raged, but did not break them. Each act of shared sacrifice echoed the boy's first gift of bread, multiplying into something that bound the valley tighter than ever before. And in the stillness of that trial, the elders spoke words that would shape the valley's memory forever. He does not fight against the drought, they said. He fights against despair. And in that battle, he cannot be defeated. Those words became their anchor, and the boy, still nameless, carried them like a shield invisible yet stronger than steel. When the rains finally returned, The valley erupted in tears more than cheers. Families danced barefoot in the mud. Children splashed in puddles. And even the oldest among them tilted their faces to the sky with gratitude. Yet in their joy, they looked to the boy not as the cause of the rain, but as the reason they had endured long enough to feel it. Without him, they might have scattered, broken, and been swallowed by the merciless West. News of their survival spread beyond the mountains. Unsettling rulers and warlords who had counted on the drought to end the boy's legend. Instead, it had only deepened it. Now, whispers called him not just a guardian, but a chosen spirit of the land, one who could not be broken by hunger, fire, or thirst. His story became a weapon sharper than any blade, inspiring hope in distant places where hope had long been buried. But hope, as powerful as it was, invited danger. A coalition of rival chiefs, fearing that the boy's influence would spill beyond his valley and weaken their control, joined together in a pact of blood. They would march with overwhelming force, determined not only to kill him, but to erase every trace of his story. For men of power understood that while bodies could be buried, legends were far harder to silence. The boy sensed the storm before it came. He did not fear death. He had lived with death his entire life. But he feared what it would mean for the girl who had once been saved by his bread, for the children who now carried his lessons, for the people who had built their strength on his vow. He did not want them to bow again to cruelty after having tasted the strength of unity. So he prepared not with walls or cannons, but with words. He stood before the valley, his voice quiet yet sharp as the edge of truth, and said, "They will come with fire and with steel, but they cannot take what we will not give. If we stand as one, no blade can cut us apart." In those words, the people found their resolve. And as the horizon darkened with the dust of an approaching army, the valley stood not behind him, but beside him, every soul ready to carry the promise he had lived from the moment he gave away his only bread. The morning the enemy arrived, the valley stood still as stone. Dust rolled across the horizon, thick and choking, carrying with it the thunder of hooves and the gleam of steel. The coalition of chiefs had gathered men from across the plains, a force larger than anything the valley had ever seen. To outsiders, it seemed impossible that a handful of farmers, widows, and children could stand against such might. Yet when the boy stepped forward, barefoot and silent, his presence calmed the trembling hands around him. He carried no rifle, no banner, only the quiet weight of his vow. The first wave struck with fury, believing fear alone would shatter the defenders. But instead of scattering, the people of the valley held fast. Farmers who had never fired more than a hunting shot stood steady with rifles. Mothers shielded their children while hurling stones, and elders who could barely walk lifted staffs in defiance. Each act of courage echoed the spirit of the boy, who walked the front line not as a commander, but as a brother among them. His silence spoke louder than orders, reminding all that they were not fighting for conquest, but for the right to live with dignity. The battle raged through the day, smoke and cries filling the valley air. Time and again, it seemed the defenders would break, but then the boy would appear, lifting the fallen, carrying the wounded, placing his own frail body between blades and those who could not stand. He never shouted, never boasted, but his refusal to retreat became the heartbeat of the fight. To the enemy, he was a mystery. How could a nameless orphan, with no crown or army, command such unyielding resistance? By nightfall, the coalition's men faltered. Exhaustion gnawed at them, but it was not fatigue that broke them. It was doubt. They looked upon the valley and saw not warriors but ordinary people, standing unbowed because of one child's unwavering vow. The chiefs screamed for their men to press on, but hearts wavered, for even the fiercest soldier could not match the strength born of love and sacrifice. And in that moment, the myth of the guardian became a living truth, undeniable even to those who had come to destroy it. When the enemy finally withdrew, leaving behind only broken banners and silence, the valley erupted not in celebration, but in tears. They had survived, though the cost was heavy. And in the center of it all, the boy knelt beside the wounded, his hands trembling yet steady, his gaze far from triumph. For he knew the battle was not won by force of arms, but by the unyielding bond of people who had chosen, as he once had, to give rather than to take. The valley never returned to what it had been before, for battles of that scale leave scars deeper than fire or drought. Graves dotted the fields, each one a reminder of the price paid for freedom. Yet from those graves grew something the West had not seen in generations, a unity so strong it could not be bent by steel. Families who once guarded their own survival now lived as one, sharing food, labor, and even grief. Their strength no longer rested on the shoulders of the boy alone. It had spread into every soul who had fought beside him. And still, the boy remained nameless. The elders pressed him to accept the title, to let his story be carved into stone, but he refused. "A name does not guard the valley," he said softly. "Hands do. Hearts do." And so he walked the fields each day, his bare feet treading the same soil as every other man and woman, his life indistinguishable from theirs, except for the vow that still burned within him. Travelers who came seeking the guardian often left in awe, disappointed not to find a towering hero clad in glory, but changed by what they did find. A simple boy, weathered by hardship, carrying buckets of water for widows, mending fences, or teaching children to plant seeds. They would whisper that perhaps this was the truest kind of legend, not a man who stood above his people, but one who stood among them, unseen until the moment he was needed most. In time, the story spread far beyond the valley. It became a tale told in ranch houses and saloons, across deserts and rivers, of the orphan who gave his last bread to a stranger, and in doing so became a guardian of many. And while versions changed with each telling, some claiming he was blessed by the heavens, others saying he commanded armies of angels, the heart of the story remained. That greatness is not forged in power, but in sacrifice. And so the valley endured, season after season, its people bound together by the legacy of one nameless boy. His story was carried not by stone monuments or gilded books, but by the lives of those he had touched. In every act of kindness, in every hand extended to lift another, his spirit walked beside them. For the West would always be harsh, but in that valley, there lived a reminder that even the smallest act of giving could shape a destiny greater than any crown. In the end, the valley did not stand because of weapons, wealth, or walls. It stood because one nameless boy gave what little he had and never stopped giving. From a single crust of bread offered to a stranger grew an unshakable bond that carried families through fire, drought, and war. What began as an act so small it could have been forgotten became the seed of a legend that reshaped an entire land. It was proof that greatness is not born in the noise of conquest, but in the quiet power of sacrifice. The boy never claimed glory, never sought titles, and never demanded loyalty. Yet his silence taught more than any proclamation could. He reminded his people, and all who heard his story, that strength lies not in standing above others, but in standing among them, unyielding when the world demands surrender. That lesson, carved into the lives of those who followed him, became his truest legacy. What is remarkable is not that the valley survived, but how it survived. Through unity, through shared burdens, and through a refusal to abandon hope, they transformed hardship into resilience. Every hardship became a chapter, every sacrifice a stone laid into the foundation of a future that no raider, drought, or tyrant could tear down. The boy was their guardian, yes, but in following him, the people became guardians of one another. This story leaves behind a question that lingers long after the fire has dimmed. What would change if we, too, chose to give when we have almost nothing left? If one child's act of kindness could lift an entire valley, then what is the measure of our own choices today? Perhaps the lesson of the West is not only about survival, but about daring to believe that a single gesture of compassion can echo louder than fear or cruelty. If this tale stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what part of the boy's journey struck you most, or what it made you reflect on. And if you want to continue walking through stories where the Old West speaks of courage, sacrifice, and hope, subscribe to the channel and like this video so you don't miss the next legend waiting to be told. Together, we keep these fires alive.